Amidst the fields that trembled with the explosion of bullets and the sky covered with smoke and fire, the doctors and nurses of World War II walked with silent but determined steps. Where death breathed with every breath, they had the task of pulling life out of the grip of darkness. Hospital tents, near the front lines, stood like small points of hope in the vast chaos. Simple structures with canvas roofs that the wind carried the sounds of the wounded from their insides and into the heart of the bloody fields. The air inside these tents was heavy. The smell of blood, sweat, dirt, and medicine mixed and saturated the space. The faint light of lamps powered by kerosene or batteries fell on the operating tables, where men and women in white coats, each one devoted themselves alone to their task amidst the din of war. The sound of surgical instruments scraping against each other, the muffled cries and the hurried steps of nurses moving from bed to bed filled the cramped space of the tent. Outside, the embankments vibrated with the sound of artillery. Military vehicles brought in the wounded one after another, bodies wrapped in blood-soaked blankets, faces sometimes contorted in pain, sometimes lost in motionless peace. Doctors had no time for lengthy diagnoses. War left no time for reflection. Everything boiled down to momentary decisions. Who would live, who would have to wait, and who would never open their eyes again. Nurses were often the first to bend over the wounded, hands that trembled but did not hesitate for a moment, finding veins hidden under layers of mud and blood. Looks that tried to inject hope into the eyes of the dying soldiers, although outside the tent, the sound of explosions was a constant reminder that death was still very close. With the few available supplies, they treated leg pain and bloodletting, bandaged wounds, and prepared the exhausted bodies for surgery. Doctors with blood-stained clothes and faces shadowed by fatigue worked for hours without stopping. In a small room of cloth, with tools that were sometimes unsuitable, they performed surgeries that, under normal circumstances, required a well-equipped room, sufficient light, and silence. But in war, tools were few, time was short, and pain was great. The fate of many wounded was determined by a few quick decisions: amputation to save lives, dressing wounds that were torn to pieces, or injecting drugs to control bleeding. In a corner of the tent, where the light was less intense, there were beds where soldiers were breathing heavily. Nurses checked their pulses and administered life-saving injections amid the sound of bombs. Their every move was a struggle between life and death. Sometimes a soldier, breathing hard and short, with arms shaking in pain, would return to recovery. But sometimes lifeless bodies would be gently left on the bed, and nurses, without having time to cry, would rush to another wounded man. At the same time, outside the tents, dusty and bloody, stretchers were lined up, ready to transport the wounded fresh from the battlefield to the heart of these small centers of hope. Sometimes the hail of bullets came so close that the walls of the tents trembled and the ground shook underfoot. But nothing slowed the steps of these white-clad men. They knew that every second that was wasted might cost them a life. Amidst all this chaos, there were also moments when hope slowly sprouted in hearts. When a soldier opened his eyes after hours of unconsciousness and glanced briefly at the shaking roof of the tent, the nurses smiled softly, even if that smile lasted no more than a few seconds. Sometimes a silent cry would rise in a corner, not from pain, but from gratitude for being alive. These voices were a reminder that even in the heart of hell, life does not surrender. Behind every bed there was a story of war, fear, courage, and hope. The white-clad frontliners accepted these stories with open arms, not to read, but to continue. They were the unassuming standard-bearers of life in the heart of a hell made of fire and iron. Every day and every night, with all their might, they walked through death, and with a trembling but firm hand, they held life so that it would not be extinguished.
Deep in the fronts, where the line of death shifted every day, mobile hospitals were like restless creatures, constantly on the move. These units had no fixed buildings, no chance of finding a safe home. They lived in the heart of hell, dismantling and rebuilding their tents with each advance or retreat. When the tanks got stuck in the mud and the infantry passed through the fire, these hospitals had to breathe right behind them to be able to take fresh blood from the hands of death. The ground beneath their feet was never still. The rain turned the soil into a heavy mud in a few hours, making every step difficult. Nurses and doctors set up operating rooms in the hollows of the ground, still warm from the previous night's explosions. Pieces of cloth and wood served as makeshift beds, and the operating table was often nothing more than the iron surface of a truck or a board resting on a few stones. Light from the lamps dripped from the canvas roofs, casting flickering shadows on their faces. The sound of the wounded trucks, vehicles that had survived the explosions, was constantly heard. They brought in the wounded and dropped them off next to the surgical line, next to the tents. Many of the stretchers were made of belts and 2 wooden beams. Nothing was as it should have been. Everything was hastily put together with improvised tools and few resources. The doctors and nurses of the front were unsurpassed masters of adaptation. They had learned to create the greatest hope with the least resources. Wherever a mobile hospital was set up, the first sound was distant gunfire, then the sound of hammers pounding the tent poles. Then a point of light emerged, slowly emerging from the darkness. Inside the tents, a thick layer of medical supplies was laid out on tables. Scissors repeatedly drawn across the soldiers' clothes, gauze soaked in blood and scalded in small pans of boiling water, syringes entrusted to the trembling hands of nurses. Sometimes the wind would blow aside the tent curtains, sending out the sound of a wounded soldier's groan, as if announcing to the world that the war was not over yet. There was no place to rest in these mobile hospitals. The doctors walked among the beds, their eyes red, their faces covered in a layer of smoke and dust. Some of them did not even know the names of the wounded. They only knew which wounds needed stitches, which had to be amputated immediately, which had to be held back until the ambulance arrived. The decisions were brutal, but they had no choice. They had little strength, little time, and the hell around them left no room for thought. Sometimes there was only a few hundred meters between the front line and the mobile hospitals. As bullets whizzed overhead, nurses sat hunched over their wounded, trying to delay death. Sometimes the sound of gunfire was so close that the staff had to leave the tent and hide behind the embankments. But after a few minutes, they returned again, because on the shabby war beds, the demand for life did not wait. At the busiest hours, the smell of medicine could no longer hide the smell of blood. Along the path to the tents, blood streaked the ground, sometimes diluted by the rain and turned into a muddy mass. There were always lists on the walls, names written in a hurry. Some were crossed out, not to die, but to be saved. The count went on, but it was not easy to count lives in hell. In every corner, instruments for washing wounds were placed on barrels. Breathless soldiers lay side by side on simple beds. One of them, in a muddy garment blackened by smoke, closed his eyes in the flickering light of the lamp. A nurse gently touched his shoulder and spread a flatter sheet over his chest. Perhaps that brief touch was the soldier's last human contact with life. In the midst of this chaos, something like peace sometimes appeared. When the bleeding stopped, when breathing calmed down again, when closed eyes became bright again, the mobile hospital workers found the courage to smile. Perhaps their smiles remained hidden under cloth masks, but their eyes showed that hope was still alive. These mobile hospitals were not just places of treatment, they were the beating heart of the front, a place where humanity survived amidst the dust and smoke. Every time the tents were opened, it was as if it was proven again that life finds a way to survive even in the midst of absolute darkness. These white-clad men, without noise, without shouts or slogans, with steady steps and wounded hands, continued the war not with bullets, but with surgery and care. And that was their silent victory.
In many places, the distance between life and death was only a cloth wall. Doctors sometimes held surgical blades in their hands as the sound of explosions rattled the instruments on the table. The air was cold,
but the doctor's hands were warmed by the warmth of the wounded's blood. In the corner of the tent, dim lights flickered and red spots fell on the rags of cloth. Many surgeries were performed under the flickering light of an oil lamp. If the lamp went out for a moment, the doctor had to stop working, and the patient was plunged into darkness. Some soldiers came with wounds that signaled the approach of the front line. Small and large pieces of metal were embedded in the flesh of their hands and feet, sometimes so deep that the surgery was more like a battle with iron than a cure. The nurses prepared the instruments without pause. Their hands sometimes trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion. They had been awake for long hours, with little sleep and little food, perhaps only a sip of water and a dry bite. Sometimes a doctor had to make difficult decisions to save a soldier's life. Amputation was the last resort, but sometimes the only way to escape death. As the blade cut, hearts were also torn. The sound of the small surgical saw echoed through the tent so that the other wounded held their breath. But there was never a moment to reflect. Every moment another wound arrived, and the wheel of life and death turned without stopping. In the corner of the room, buckets filled with bloody bandages stood, a sign that several bodies had been pulled from the shadow of death and several more souls had perhaps silently departed. Each time the procedure was completed, the doctor would take a deep breath, and sometimes a drop of sweat would fall from his forehead onto the patient's face. But without stopping, he would immediately move on to the next throne. War offered no opportunity for glory. Only the humiliating struggle to keep lives alive remained.
Even when the bullets died down, a silent enemy lurked: infection. Wounds created in the hell of dirt and mud quickly took on the color of infection. The acrid smell of infection permeated the cramped space of the tent. Medical supplies were limited. Penicillin was as precious as gold. Doctors and nurses carefully distributed the medicine to the wounded. Some received only a few drops, some never got their turn. Bandages were reused after washing. The water used to clean the wounds was sometimes collected from the muddy river near the front. Every time the nurse opened the bandage, the fear of spreading the infection gripped her heart. Still, she cleaned the wounds carefully, even though she knew that the same wounds could be fatal tomorrow. Medics had learned from the past that war was not won by guns alone. It was also determined by the resistance of the human body. Every body that escaped infection on the battlefield was a victory over a faceless enemy. But many, in a silent battle, fell before a shot was fired. Nurses sometimes sat by the bedside for hours, waiting for a soldier's fever to subside. Sometimes the fever subsided and the soldier breathed. Sometimes the fever rose and his eyes went dark.
In the heart of the fronts that opened their mouths to fire every day and breathed with the sound of explosions, there were women whose white clothes were like a banner of life amidst the cruelty of death. They had come from cities, villages, and universities, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes by order, but all with hearts that were ruled not by war, but by humanity. Many of them, before the war began, had given their hands to books and children instead of touching blood and wounds. But now, under a shower of bullets, in a land covered with mud and blood, their weapon was a small bandolier, a half-empty syringe, and their shelter was only the trembling shadow of cloth tents. As the trains carrying the wounded arrived from the front lines, the women who were cultivating the plant of peace in their hearts made their way to the most dangerous parts of the field. The sound of the wheel rolling on the rails, accompanied by weak and sometimes wordless screams, squeezed the hearts of these women. They knew that with every step they took, their lives could be on the verge of death. However, the nurses, with hands that were sometimes trembling from the cold and sometimes from the horror of war, carried the stretchers and guided the half-dead soldiers from the darkness to the faint light of the medical tents. When they entered the tent, there was no medical palace, no equipped operating room, only tables made of wooden boards and weak lamps hanging from the fabric ceiling. Amid the smoke and the smell of blood, the nurses washed the wounds with hands that had been tired and wounded many times during the day. Sometimes, to wash a wound, they only had muddy water that had collected from the holes near the front. This water was a great danger in itself, but the lack of clean water forced them to use it, perhaps for a few more hours of life. Hours passed in the medical tents, and every minute a nurse had to decide which soldier would live. They were not doctors, but often there was no time for a doctor to arrive. Many of them played the role of surgeons themselves, not from academic experience, but from experience in war. Their hands knew how to close a wound, how to reduce the poison of infected wounds, how to save a soldier from a slow death. Sometimes, without anesthesia, they would close a wound with the clenched teeth of a soldier whose groans were lost in the fire and smoke. Their white clothes were no longer white. Stains of blood, dirt, and sweat had robbed them of their whiteness on the first day of the war. The aprons that had to be changed after each shift were so scarce that many nurses had to wash their clothes in cold water at night in the darkness by the light of a small candle and return to the field in the morning with the same half-soaked clothes. But they never complained. Instead, only a determined silence reigned among them, showing that their duty was greater than any cold or fear. On many nights, when the sky was lit up with the light of the artillery and the ground beneath their feet trembled with the force of the explosions, the nurses ran between the beds. The sound of the mortars came so close that they felt the earth tremble under their feet. At such moments, neither fear flashed in their eyes, nor did their legs weaken. Instead of taking shelter, they hurriedly dragged the injured bodies of the soldiers under the tables so that the storm of death could pass over them. When the danger temporarily subsided, work resumed as if nothing had happened. In a corner of the tent, a nurse would sometimes kneel and wipe the beads of sweat from the forehead of an unconscious soldier. There was nothing but hope in her eyes, even though she knew the chances of survival were slim. This hope was the weapon that gave the women strength. They knew that to others they might be little healers, but to a soldier hanging between life and death, their presence was a means of returning home, or at least of dying peacefully. Sometimes at night, after hours of uninterrupted labor, the nurses would sit in a corner for a few moments, their eyes fixed on a point, their minds empty of sight and sound. But even in that brief silence, distant cries could be heard, the voice of a soldier calling for his mother, the pained whisper of someone moaning for a sip of water, the faint sigh of someone who knew his days were over. The nurses, however, had no time to get lost in these sounds. After a few short breaths, they would rise again and return to the line of death and life. Sometimes, when the front calmed down for a few hours, they would sit together and patch their bloody clothes, fabrics that bore witness to thousands of wounds and rescues. In the silence, the only sound was the sound of thread and needles sewing the wounded fabric back together as they brought the wounded bodies back to life. In rare moments, when a soldier was saved from death and a faint smile appeared on his lips, these nurses felt a small spark of joy in their hearts. These few seconds gave them strength again, strength that no medicine could provide. Despite their fatigue, despite the pain in their bones and the burning of the small wounds on their hands, they felt that they could still continue the war in another way, by keeping the flame of life, however small and trembling. In the story of war, the sound of drums and guns is louder, but the silence of the nurses marked a hidden heroism that history has had difficulty remembering. Women on the death line, unarmed and unarmored, but with a courage as great as the cannons, stood in the middle of the fields to prove that life can still endure even in the darkest hours of war. They not only repaired bodies, but also healed a hidden wound in the human soul, the wound of loneliness at the moment of death. These women were the front line in white, not with the essence of command, but with the essence of kindness. They proved that amidst fire and blood, the touch of a human hand can be the last bastion of life.
The sky still smelled of smoke, and the ground held the heat of the previous day's explosions. The operating room that had been erected in the heart of this devastation had neither stone walls nor a roof to rely on.
Only large mats stretched over wooden frames provided a semi-shade so that the surgeons could focus on the wounds that were every moment making the line between life and death clearer. In the corners of the fabric ceiling, holes from shrapnel could be seen, black spots that bore witness to nights when the sky had rained fire and iron. The ground beneath the feet of the doctors and nurses was always wet, from blood, water, and sometimes plasmas that were placed haphazardly and hopefully beside the beds. The air was thick with the smell of alcohol, burnt flesh, and wet dirt. The sounds were always fragmented, the cries of soldiers being brought in, the quick, short whispers of doctors making decisions, and sometimes an unexpected silence that only meant one thing: we're late. The center of this world was the simple operating tables, made of broken window frames and useless metal legs. Blood-stained blankets were spread over them, and beside them stood lamps powered by half-dead batteries. Their light was yellow and flickering, but the same fragile darkness illuminated the greatest battlefield of all: a human body. The surgeons stood around the tables, their aprons no longer recognizable in their original color. Many of them had not slept for weeks. Some had not even had a chance to eat for hours. Their glasses were steamed up, their gloves cracked and sticky, but despite all this disorder, their movements were precise. Sometimes they acted so calmly and controlled that if it weren't for the waves of explosions, you would think they were in one of the best hospitals in the world in silence. Anesthesia was just a name. If drugs had arrived, the soldiers might have forgotten the pain for a moment, but often, apart from a few drops of ether or sometimes even a sip of alcohol, there was nothing to relieve them. Many groaned on the beds and held the nurses' hands so tightly that if they let go, they would no longer be able to bear the pain. The nurses were not just comforters in these moments. They were pillars that held the patient's psyche so that his body would not be left alone in the fight against death. Surgical tools were limited. Sometimes an old saw was the only means of amputation, a cold, slow, and ruthless instrument that neither hid the sound of penetrating bone nor wounded the heart of anyone who witnessed it. Screwdrivers collected from destroyed houses played the role of bone clamps. Sutures were sewn from torn white cloth. Any device that could prolong life for a moment was part of this war. In a corner of the operating room, there was always a bucket of cold water in which the doctors dipped their hands after each operation. But this water was not always clean, and the doctors knew it. Sometimes, to reduce infection, the only solution was to cauterize the wound. The smell of burning flesh mingled with the sound of the soldiers' screams, and a heavy silence fell over the room. Even those who left the room carried this smell with them for years. Amid the noise of instruments and screams, whispers could be heard. Doctors whispering to a soldier in a low voice, "Hold on, you're coming home." Or a nurse looking into the patient's dull eyes with a trembling smile and saying, "It's not over yet. You're still with us." In many moments, these words were the only hope that kept them from dying. During the surgery, doctors raced against the clock in their minds. With the bleeding, with their breathing gradually becoming calmer, sometimes they had to make a decision in a matter of minutes that could mean life or death. These decisions were not always easy. Whenever you asked them what the hardest part of their job was, their answer was neither amputation nor death. The hardest moment was when they had to decide which patient was worth their time. Out of the 5 wounded, only 1 could be saved. Choosing that one person, this tore the doctor's soul more than any physical wound. But in all this chaos, there were moments when the operating room became a scene of victory. When a weak soldier's pulse regained strength, when the eyes of someone they thought were lost opened, when the nurse saw a faint smile on the wounded man's face, all those smells, sounds, pressures were forgotten for a moment, as if a small light was pouring down from the torn roof of the tent and shining on everyone's bodies and minds. Sometimes after surgery, the doctors would sit by the bed with bloody hands and look at the ceiling for a moment. The sound of artillery was getting closer in the distance, but they were too tired to be afraid. They knew that if fear found a way into the heart, the hands would tremble, and trembling meant death. So they would clear their minds, take a deep breath, and get up again. Maybe another soldier would have a chance at life. At the end of each day, buckets full of bloody bandages would pile up in a corner. These bandages had countless stories between them. Each stain of blood was a tale of a struggle that might have ended in victory, might have ended in defeat. But the doctors and nurses looked at each stain as a monument to effort and courage. Inside that shaking operating room, the only rule was to keep going. It didn't matter what was happening outside, how many mortars were whizzing in the sky, or how much dust settled on the tent. As long as even a small light was on, as long as a doctor or nurse was standing by, the operating room would survive. Here was where humanity stood against death, with tired hands, with wounded hearts, but with a will that no explosion could extinguish.
The cold wind carried the smell of gunpowder and swirled between the medical tents. The sky was gray, and the ground was covered with thick, heavy mud that made every step difficult. In between, nurses walked, their faces hidden under a layer of fatigue. They were not only the doctor's assistants, but also the living pulse of hope among the lines where death walked. Nothing escaped their eyes. The trembling hand of a soldier who had just returned from battle, the drops of blood dripping from the bandage, or the lifeless eyes that silently mourned the world. They were on the first line of contact with pain. Sometimes, before the doctors arrived, it was the nurses who bound wounds, stopped the bleeding, and hurriedly took vital signs. Many of them worked while shrapnel fell around them. The sound of mortars was not unfamiliar to them. Sometimes they came so close that the ground trembled beneath their feet, and the tent lights, like a sick heart, momentarily failed. But neither their feet trembled nor their gazes. They knew that if they stood still, even for a moment, lives would be extinguished. The nurses were not only concerned with healing the bodies, but also with sustaining the souls of the wounded. They knew that many soldiers were more afraid of being alone in difficult moments than of their wounds. So they sat beside them, even when there was nothing else to do. Sometimes they held hands frozen in pain. Sometimes they caressed a soldier who, in his delirium, whispered his mother's name. And sometimes they were just silent, a silence that was more comforting than 1,000 words. The nurses' white uniforms soon took on the color of war. The red, brown, and dark stains were a distant reminder that this was no place for purity. Each stain had a story to tell, a wound that might have healed, or perhaps had only been temporarily healed. These clothes stood like flags amidst the dirt and mud, signs of an effort to breathe life into the devastation. Sometimes they tied pieces of bandage to their belts for quick access, bandages that had become rough and dry from use. Often they had to do things they would never have imagined before the war. They washed deep wounds, stitched them up, and sometimes even took a direct part in minor surgeries. Their training was short, but the experience they gained each day in the field was more valuable than any classroom. Being a doctor's assistant was only part of their job. Outside the tent, they were guides for the wounded, organizers of equipment, and even unwritten psychotherapists for the soldiers. The nurses often got stuck in the mud as they carried the wounded on stretchers. The air was filled with screams and smoke. Amidst the shrapnel and flying cogs, they kept walking, their bodies bending under the weight of the wounded. Sometimes they had to move quickly because the enemy was approaching. Sometimes they had to run while the sound of bullets could be heard from the closest distance, but they did not lag behind. Every step they took seemed an attempt to snatch another life from the clutches of death. At night, when the weather grew cold and dark, they continued to work in the dimly lit tents. Many of the nurses had forgotten sleep. If they closed their eyes for a moment, it was as if a fresh groan had awakened them. The small flamed oil lamps cast long shadows on the walls, shadows that sometimes rose like ghosts through the smoke. But they were used to these shadows. Fear was present in their hearts, but it was never the commanding one. In the midst of this chaos, deep friendships were formed. The nurses were like family to each other. Everyone knew the other without the opportunity for long conversations. Sometimes they understood each other just by looking, which one should sleep, which one should go to the new soldier, which one needed rest. But more often, there was no time for rest. Each one left a part of his soul in the field to lift the other up. And although the laughter was few, even that little light shone a small light in the darkness of war. The nurses on these lines witnessed moments that few could bear to see. They not only looked at the soldiers' wounds, but also drowned in their eyes that wandered between life and death. Sometimes, when death was inevitable, the nurse simply changed her mission. She helped the gentle flow of life until the very end. She would hold a soldier's hand, sit quietly next to him, and let his last breath be more peaceful. In those moments, death came silently, not with a scream. And the nurses, in silence, saw him off. But as difficult as it was to watch death, it was beautiful to watch life. Sometimes, a soldier who had entered half dead the day before would have a faint smile on his face the next day. The nurse's heart warmed when she saw that smile, a sign that the efforts had not been in vain. These smiles, these fresh breaths, were the strength that prepared them for the days to come. It was as if each saved life was a small star shining in the darkness of the night. Many nurses were not alone on the battlefield. It was as if a part of their soul was always with the soldiers that they had seen, touched, and sometimes lost. Names that never were forgotten, faces that remained alive in their minds. Sometimes at night, in silence, they would cry, remembering them. But the tears would only flow for a moment, and then dry up, because the next morning, another battle awaited. Frontline nurses were not only witnesses, but also fighters. They fought the wounds with an antidote of love and determination. Amidst the fire and smoke, they were echoes of hope. People who, with wearied hands, kept the light of life burning in the endless darkness of war.
Field hospitals, like living creatures, were always on the move, as if they had to move constantly to survive. They never took root in the battlefields, because the ground beneath their feet could tremble under enemy fire at any moment. The tents were made of thick, faded fabrics. The walls were sometimes so thin that the shadows of the soldiers behind them could be seen, and every bit of light or fire passed through them. These hospitals were sometimes set up on ground soaked by the night's rains, sometimes on dry, cracked soil that trembled under the blows of artillery. Every day, at sunrise, medical convoys set off in search of a safer place. Trucks filled to the brim with simple equipment, meager supplies, washed-out blood-stained bandages, and makeshift beds moved along roads that were sometimes nothing more than muddy, uneven tracks. Every jolt of the truck was a shock to the bodies of those who breathed and fought for their lives in their shaking beds. The groans and groans of the wounded mingled with the roar of the truck's engine, creating a sound that no one wanted to hear. Finding a suitable place to set up tents again was never easy. Medical reconnaissance teams moved in a hurry. Sometimes they had to choose between burned-out warehouses, half-ruined buildings, or the slightly safer plains. Every choice was a big gamble. Would it be safe here? Would the enemy see it? Would there be enough time to put up tents, set up beds, and prepare makeshift operating rooms? Sometimes, the answer was not clear, but time would not wait. Once a location was chosen, everyone got to work. Some set up wooden structures, some pitched tents, and nurses and doctors began admitting the wounded at the first moment. No one waited for complete readiness. It seemed that every minute, a soldier was dying. So the first beds were sometimes placed on the muddy ground, and surgeries began before the lights were even turned on. Inside the field hospitals, life and death were constantly present. The narrow corridors of the tents were filled with nurses hurrying back and forth, their hands full of bandages, serum, or rare vials of medicine. On each bed lay a soldier with a different story, one with a bullet in the chest, one silenced by a mine explosion, and another breathing, but still in shock. Sometimes, wounded men from both sides of the front lay side by side. The enemy they had been trying to kill just a few hours earlier was now fighting under the same roof. Not against each other, but against death. The makeshift operating rooms were the heart of these hospitals. Lights hung from the tent ceiling on wires. Their light was unstable, but enough for the surgeon to find his way through the mass of blood and flesh. Behind each bed were baskets of primitive tools, knives, forceps, clamps, sutures, and sometimes even tools that were never made for surgery, but that had become the only means of survival in the field. In a corner, there were metal containers that were being rolled in boiling water to give life once again. But field hospitals were not only places of treatment, they were also places to wait. In the far tents, soldiers were lying in wait for time. Some, with half-open eyes, looked at the ceiling, as if searching for heaven and home among the white and gray cloth. Others, with short groans, whispered names that lived in the corners of the world, unaware of this hell. Nurses who passed by them would stop for a moment, pull the blankets higher, or put a drop of water on their lips. Small things, but with great meaning. Sometimes, the enemy would come so close that the sound of gunfire would pound the thin walls of the tent like a sledgehammer. At such moments, the doctors and nurses had to make an urgent decision: leave the hospital or stay and take their chances. In many cases, the latter option was chosen: stay. They knew that if they stayed, they might save a few more lives. And if they left, patients would be left behind who would not have a chance to move. So, despite the danger, they often stayed. But staying was not always possible. Sometimes, the order to evacuate quickly came. The enemy was too close. At these times, the sound of shouting and haste filled the hospital. The wounded who could walk were carried out with assistance. Those who could not move were placed on stretchers. But the most heartbreaking moment was when there was not enough time for everyone. The nurses knew that some wounded could never be taken, not because of reluctance, but because of a cruel reality. Those who did not have time stayed behind, and a painful silence enveloped the tent. Before leaving, the nurses sat next to them, pulled the blanket over them, and whispered softly in their ears. The last human warmth before death swallowed the tent. The constant movement of field hospitals left a scar on the souls of the medical staff. Every time they packed up a tent, they took with them memories. Smiles they had seen, tears they had wiped, and deaths they had witnessed. But there was no time to stop. Every time new tents were set up, life began again. The same repetitive cycle of death and life, darkness and hope. These hospitals were the true picture of war, signs of the human struggle to preserve life even as the world was falling apart. In each tent, stories were told, stories anonymous, but deeper than any official narrative. And in the midst of all this chaos, doctors and nurses stood, silent sentinels, fighting for every new heartbeat with weary hands, but steadfast hearts.
From a distance, the war roads looked like veins carrying the blood of the dead away from death. Aid convoys in old ambulances and trucks with roofs covered with iron sheets moved through deserts, forests, and half-ruined villages. The paths were often muddy, broken, and under enemy fire. Every step the wheels took on the ground could be the last. Mine-strewn passages, narrow roads on the edge of the precipice, and ambushes that sometimes lurked far from sight made the movement of these convoys a kind of gamble with death. In each vehicle there were wounded people breathing hard. Blood-soaked bandages were pressed against their chests or thighs to stop the bleeding, but success was not always guaranteed. The sound of the engine vibrating, sometimes combined with a soft moaning sound coming from a dark corner of the truck. The nurses sat next to the wounded, one hand on the patient's pulse, the other on the blood vessels that shook with every jolt of the vehicle. They tried to keep blood, air, and hope flowing to the wounded. In many cases, they had to stop halfway, not to rest, but to quickly treat a soldier whose condition was deteriorating. In the middle of the road, on the wet dirt, the doctor knelt and tried to open the soldier's airway or stop the bleeding. The light from the nurses' canes in the air fell on the wounded body, casting chaotic shadows on the ground. The sound of tires and the engine grinding away mingled with the soldier's interrupted breathing. The end could have come at any moment. If the convoy had to move quickly, the doctor would sometimes still have his hand on the wound, but time would never allow him to wait. The movement of these convoys in urban areas was no easier. Many streets were covered in rubble, half-collapsed buildings, broken windows, and iron beams protruding from the ground blocked the way. Sometimes they had to remove the wounded from the cars and move them on stretchers through the houses and narrow alleys. Every alley held the danger of ambush. The whistle of bullets came from unknown distances. No one knew where the shots were coming from, but everyone bent down and bent their bodies over the wounded so that the head that still had hope might be saved. In the forest areas, conditions were different but equally dangerous. The roads were narrow and full of stones, and sometimes the cars got stuck in the mud. When this happened, everyone helped. Even soldiers with superficial wounds, gritting their teeth, got out of the vehicle to shovel the mud away with shovels or even their hands. Time was still a terrible enemy. The smoke of burning trees filled the air, and the sound of half-burnt branches falling mixed with the heavy breathing of the wounded. Although the convoys were often marked with medical flags, the enemy did not always respect these signs. Sometimes the arrows passed over the vehicles, sometimes directly at them. At such moments, the drivers had to move at an unimaginable speed. The heavy truck rolled and the nurses struggled to keep their balance. The wounded, amidst the tremors, groaned louder, and the bandages that had just been applied came undone. But no one could stop. Death in the rearview mirror was closer than they thought. On some journeys, the caravans had to travel by train. Old wagons with wooden benches or no seats at all were converted into mobile hospitals. Blankets were spread on the floor of each wagon for the wounded to lie on. Doctors on the move, using tools stored in small boxes, bandaged wounds. The motion of the train made the job harder. Every twist and turn could throw the blade off course. However, there was no other option. The goal was only one: to get these lives to a safer place. But sometimes there was no safe destination. The retreating hospitals were under fire or destroyed, so the caravans had to change course. Sometimes they would travel for hours on end until the map was no longer useful. The only guide was the stars of the night and hope. In some places, they had to cross bridges that were barely standing. The broken wood bent under the weight of the cars, and every crackling sound made their hearts tremble. The blood caravans not only transported the wounded, but also carried stories that walked on the border between life and death. Every soldier who was saved along the way was a witness to the will of man. Every nurse or doctor who sat next to the wounded knew in his heart that he might not reach the end of the road, but that he had kept lives alive along the way. At night, when the caravan stopped by the side of the road, the dark sky was the only observer of these stories. Without lights, in silence, they continued to care for the wounded. The only light came from the stars that shone on the blood-stained pavements. At the end of each journey, the destination was sometimes a large tent, sometimes a dilapidated stone building with the roof still standing, and sometimes there was nothing, just the ground. But it didn't matter. They would pitch the tent, set up the beds, and life would begin again. The caravans of blood knew that there was no real end. Each journey was the beginning of another. Each rescue was a preparation for a new battle, not with bullets, but with death.
In the final days of the war, when the ground was worn away under the boots of armies and the cities were more like burnt shadows of the past, doctors and nurses also reached their last battlefields, where no trenches remained, no intact walls, only ruins and lines lost in the smoke and dust. They knew that every day could be the last, but they fought as best they could. Not with guns, not with artillery, but with bandages, serum, two trembling hands and hearts that still resisted the darkness. In these final days, the number of wounded had increased, and the supply of medicine had reached its lowest point. Sometimes they had to divide medicine among the sick, not according to need, but according to possibility. It was a repetitive image: gray faces, bloody clothes, and hands searching the floor or bed for a sheet or a piece of cloth to bandage the wound. The
The doctors, with a weary look, went from one wounded man to another, checking pulses, and at every moment making decisions that would keep their sleep disturbed for years to come. The nurses, pale but determined, were at their side. They not only bandaged the wounds, but also held the soldiers' trembling hands in their final moments. Sometimes, until their last breath, they whispered to them dreams, the name of their child or city, or even a quiet silence that eased the pain a little. No one was alone in that moment, as long as one of them was still standing. In the midst of the ruins of a city that no longer had a name, there was a hospital with a hole in its roof from a bombing. Rain dripped through the holes and fell on the wet cloths and cold tools, but the work went on. Even as the sirens screamed overhead and the sound of the planes drew closer, no one stopped. In a room with no glass, a young doctor bent over a wounded soldier, trying to stop the bleeding from his stomach. The ground shook as the nearby explosion shook the room. Broken glass that had been left in the corner of the wall fell to the ground with a sharp thud. The nurse next to him held the blood container tightly to keep it from spilling. Any moment of pause could mean the end. Sometimes operations were carried out in the basements, a dark place filled with the smell of dampness and blood. Candles and dim lights cast narrow shadows on the walls. On the floor, boxes of medicine and barrels of water were lined up side by side. The doctors operated carefully, but at any moment, the sound of the ceiling collapsing or the enemy's attack could be heard. The beating of the patients' hearts, along with their own, rang in their ears. There was no time for fear, only time for action. But amidst this darkness and pressure, there were also moments when a small light could be seen. Sometimes, a soldier whom everyone had despaired of saving would slowly open his eyes. His short breaths would lengthen, and a spark of life would shine in his eyes. At these moments, the doctors and nurses would smile softly, not from victory, but from seeing life continue. It was a small hope, but it was enough to get them up again. The war was drawing to a close, but for them, the end was not just the silence after the artillery. After the shooting stopped, another challenge began. Wounds that were still open, souls that had been burned. They walked the fields, searching for those who were still breathing. Sometimes only a soft sound came from under the rubble that showed that someone was still alive. They searched until the last moment, pushing aside stones and considering each life a second chance. When the war ended, many of these doctors and nurses returned home, but not as they had left. Their gazes grew heavy. Their hands held the memory of 1,000 last touches. Many never returned. They too died alongside the soldiers who defended the borders. Their names were not on the battle list, but their work was part of the heart of the war, building life amidst the destruction. And in the silence after the war, the makeshift hospitals slowly collapsed. The beds were emptied, the tents were lowered. But the memory of those days remained deep in the earth. In every embankment that once hosted a wounded man, in every fragment of rock that once served as the roof of a makeshift hospital, there is a hidden story. The story of those who with their own hands pushed back death, not for victory, but for life. They were the last guards of the front, and even today, in the silence of museums and books, their whispers can be heard, the voices of those who built a life in the midst of hell.